For this special edition of Spotlight on COVID for Refugee Week, I'm talking to Dr. Leonie Ansems de Vries, Senior Lecturer in International Relations in the Department of War Studies, King's College London. One of Leonie's areas of expertise is on migration and refugees. In particular, the relationship between the management of migration and migrants' struggles for mobility, refugee experiences of being on the move, and legal pathways to protection. Today, we're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on forced migration and what challenges vulnerable refugee populations might face as the disease continues to spread. In terms of COVID, the world has been focusing on the global disaster, that is the COVID-19 pandemic. Have we forgotten about the plight of refugees as we've turned inwards to manage the fallout in our own countries?
On the one hand, yes, there's been more of an inward focus, but on the other hand, actually, I think we've seen some positive highlights as well, actually, of the kind of things that migrants might be facing, and the kind of, direct and structural violence that they are experiencing. So there's some more positive attention as well. Having said that, I think focus has turned away again from others in more marginalized situations, and especially people that are not so visible, right? So these might be refugees, these might be asylum seekers. We can think about people in informal settlements, as I've already spoken about, and I can say more about that later. We can think about people in migration detention as well, often very vulnerable, and of course in places like detention centres, virus can spread quite easily. Now the numbers have been reduced in migration detention in the UK, but there's still quite a few people that are detained, and also people that would be very much at risk of the disease. But we can also think about others in unstable housing conditions, and more generally people that, and we see this often with asylum seekers and refugees, they might face isolation, right? And that might just not be picked up on.
Yes, I was going to come on to that. Because I personally haven't heard that much about the situation for refugees at the moment. How are they managing the spread of the disease in some of these very vulnerable and precarious communities?
Yes, well, it varies. It varies very much depending on where you are. Whether we look at the UK as for detention centres, or whether we look at informal settlements. But so I've mostly looked at informal settlements in France, especially in northern France, and as well as a bit elsewhere. So I can say a little bit, for instance, about Lebanon as well. So I think the first thing to say, especially in more informal spaces, is that we don't really know, right? Because we don't have a clear insight of what's happening. But speaking to people that are on the ground in northern France, so it must be said, I think the first thing that has to be said, that the conditions were already appalling. So this is what I've, together with Marta Wieland, I've called the politics of exhaustion. So there is the policies that are designed, that policies about migration are designed to make life as difficult as possible for people that are there irregularly. So that means, evictions. That means people are often living in tents, if they even get tents, because often they get slashed by the police and so on, right? So you see this kind of daily violence, and also the violence of being in very uncertain conditions for a long time, and not knowing where you can go, not knowing what your status is, and so on. So that's the kind of basic condition, which is quite appalling. Now, it must be said that during the lockdown, and of course France had a very strict lockdown, there were some measures, there was some accommodation that was offered, there was some testing at some point and so on, and there was some food provision, but it was very much inadequate. And also, and this was quite extraordinary, they kept the, especially in Calais, but in Dunkirk as well, they continued doing raids of these very informal spaces, and of course that put people at risk. But also the police unions were against this as well. But so we see people that are very vulnerable conditions already. When there is a global pandemic, when nobody's allowed to move if it's not strictly necessary, we still see raids on these kind of camps. And there have been ongoing struggles. So the sort of the two bigger camps that existed up to 2016 that were destroyed at that time, there's still people in that area. So for 4 years they've been in these very difficult conditions, and that has just continued. But also during that time, there's been fights just for getting basic necessities like, you know, water, food, sanitation, and so on. So there's some stuff that's being handed out, but, you know, some food's been handed out, but it's mostly sort of dried food, no hot foods anymore. There were some water points installed, but there was only for a particular period. And then in Dunkirk, for instance, and they took them away again, so people don't even have access to clean drinking water and so on. So yes, it's very difficult. So there's been, you know, some provisions, which is good. For instance, some provisions for people, you know, that can go to hospital, though again might be difficult to get onto a bus because then, you know, they might not allow migrants on the bus and so on. And there have been some also provision, some accommodation for people that have COVID symptoms but are not that serious. But there have also been reports of people that do go for a little while and then leave that accommodation again because they don't feel safe. I think one of the big problems there is that because there's so much violence in the area on behalf of the authorities, that people are very afraid to trust the authorities. And if, you know, if the police come and say, like, we'll bring you to accommodation, and I say, well, I don't trust you. So that's been a real issue.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the theme for Refugee Week this year is Imagine, and we've seen unimaginable actions taken by governments all around the world in response to the pandemic, forms of socialist policies being implemented in, for example, Britain. And more recently, we've seen protesters demanding an end to forms of structural racism following the killing of George Floyd. Do you think this pandemic could bring about a fairer world where we better value and protect human life?
I'd really like to say yes, but I'm skeptical. This is very much, I think, a moment of change, and we should take this up as a moment of change as well. But these things are always sort of complex and you know, and move in different directions at the same time. So I'm skeptical about just creating this fairer world, but I'm very keen to push for more social and racial justice, and I think that's what we really need to do. So yes, this is certainly a moment of upheaval and change, and hopefully we can take up that moment. I think the Black Lives Matter movement is very important at the moment. The issue of structural racism and other forms of racism is absolutely nothing new. People have been fighting for racial justice for a very long time as well. But I think what seems to be different at the moment, and I haven't seen so much before, and this includes me reflecting myself as well, is this acknowledgement that structural racism exists. And has existed for a long time, and that it permeates our societies, and we really need to reflect on that and do something about this. And the question of white privilege and whiteness as well has come up in a way that I think, or the kind of acknowledgement of it and understanding of it, I think is growing, and I think that is very important. And also for me, thinking about my research, but also thinking about who I am and so on, it's also, I think, a moment to really think about these relationships between the movement of people, violence and race, in a way that some scholars have done for decades in a fantastic way. But again, I think a lot of us, including myself, haven't done enough of that. And I think there's a moment to really think about that. So, you know, we cannot understand, if we just think about Europe for a moment, we cannot understand our European history, our systems of thought, as well as our practices, without thinking about the forced migration of slavery and colonialism more generally, right? And also we cannot understand the movement of people today and our conceptions of race, of justice and so on, without interrogating these kind of histories, as well as the way in which it plays out today. So the idea of coloniality, the colonial present, rather than just thinking of something that happened in the past. And I think that has, and that should have real implications also for thinking about how we, you know, lead our daily lives, what we do, what we reflect on, and so on. So I think in that regard, this is a really important moment.
Definitely. And lastly, what can we do as individuals to help refugees at this time as we reflect on the immense challenges they face during Refugee Week?
Yeah, that's an important question as well. I think, firstly, if we going back to my answer to the previous question, if you haven't already done so, try and read up on the question of migration and refugees, but also these interlinkages. and ask questions about migration, imperialism, race, colonialism, and so on. I think that's one thing, and that's a more general thing I think that we should all do. Support charities. There is still a lot of work going on, and there is actually, as well as there is a lot of isolation of people and so on, there is a lot of work going on by charities and people on the ground that still help out for refugees, and whether that's it's around issues of health or around isolation or just food and so on. So that I think that can be done as well. So you can support them financially, you can see if you can get involved virtually or otherwise. And I think also in the UK context, really thinking about the hostile environment more broadly, and thinking about the hostile environment not something that the government does out there and that's problematic, but something that's diffused throughout society that affects refugees, but also others. And really think about our own communities, our own institutions, our own organizations, and how does it play out there, or does it play out there, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.